Hello again, security community. Welcome to another video tutorial to help you get started and make the best of ServiceNow. My name is Eric Ferron in Santa Clara, California, and my guest today for this new episode is Don Harlan. Don is advisory solution consultant at ServiceNow. Good afternoon, Don, and welcome to the show.
Hey, good afternoon, Eric, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So, Don, please tell us a little bit about yourself that the audience gets to know you a bit more.
Well, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, Eric, I am an advisory solution consultant at ServiceNow. I work in the security and risk practice. I've actually been here about 2.5, almost 3 years now. Started as kind of a core SC working in all areas. My background comes from IT, so I started in IT about 21 years ago with a heavy emphasis on server hardening, vulnerability response, and security response.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here with us today, Don, and sharing your expertise. So today you're going to help us get started with vulnerability response. So tell us a little bit about the value that our audience is going to get out of listening to this tutorial for the next 10 or 15 minutes.
So our goal today is really to give you the basics of vulnerability, right? To make sure you understand the various components of vulnerability response and really how to set them up. Furthermore, what we're going to do is help divide that work into logical units so that you can spread that amongst your teams, whether that's based on location or department or type of asset that you might be dealing with. We all know that we have a large amount of vulnerabilities, and how do we manage those? How do we prioritize those?
All right. So our agenda for today, I'm first going to take us all onto a series of refreshers to make sure we are all on the same page. And then Don is going to take us through a general overview of vulnerability response and then an in-product demo. So let's get started, right? In terms of refreshers, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. And you will remember, if you have watched the previous episode, that we always look at your success with ServiceNow products along what we call the maturity model, starting from a place before you started using ServiceNow products where you were probably having a large set of spreadsheets where your visibility was quite limited on what was going on. And it was quite a lot of work, right? And our ambition by doing these tutorials and like the one today is to take you to what we call maturity level 1, which is represented here at a stage of automated prioritization. Now, in the future, there will be also additional maturity levels, but these will be the object of future tutorials. Similarly, if you've watched the previous episodes of this series, you will remember that we've built for you what we call a new customer's path. And this new customer's path today is considered of 3 big streams. We run the first tutorial around how to prepare your implementation of vulnerability response. The second episode was around how to implement the solution. And we talked also about what happens when you are live. We started doing deep dives around how to select a partner. And in addition to this, recently we added a technical stream where we had a tutorial about notifications. One is coming on reports and dashboard, and the one we're going to have today is really a quick setup guide for vulnerability response. All right, then, with no further ado, Don, please take it away.
So we're going to just start out with a couple slides before we dive into the solution, where we're going to spend the majority of the rest of our time. The first thing I want to talk about is really, where does security operations fit, and more specifically, vulnerability response. Something I want you to all keep in mind is that ServiceNow is a system of action and engagement, not a system of detection. So you'll see as we build out this slide that there's many different technology partners that we can digest information from. From a vulnerability standpoint, it's going to be Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, etc. All of that information is going to then flow into ServiceNow, which at its heart is forms-based workflow. Data automatically shows up in a form, we automatically do something. And so we leverage the CMDB and those workflows and automation to digest those huge amounts of data from other sources and then make them actionable so that you can prioritize what you should be responding to, and more importantly, manage that large volume of work across multiple teams and potentially multiple departments, whether that's vulnerability, security, and operations. That is what ServiceNow is going to do, is help us better respond to our vulnerability workload, ensuring we're focusing on what we need to when we should. The second thing I want to talk about is really that key of prioritization. There's a lot of good information out there from third parties, right? Whether that's the CVSS score or the third-party score information that we might digest from your vulnerability scanner. We'll even reach out to Shodan, which uses Metasploit and ExploitDB, to determine, is there a known exploit for this vulnerability? And all of that information is great, right? We certainly need that information to give some level of prioritization around that. But what none of those solutions can tell you is your own tribal knowledge. That's your CMDB. And at the heart of ServiceNow is CMDB. So what we're actually showing here is the idea of a business service map. And what it is from a high level down, looking at something that is critical to the organization and all of the pieces of infrastructure that make up that service. Now, not everyone's here today, and that's okay. You can even start to tag assets of whether they contain PCI or PII, or just simply that they're critical to you. And based off of that, we can leverage that information in the CMDB to help assess and prioritize risk associated with vulnerability. That's something that literally no one other than yourselves can actually tell you. And that is at the heart of ServiceNow. And we will leverage that as we go forward. All right, folks, well, let's dive right into the actual setup around vulnerability and some of those quick basics that we can share. All right, folks, so let's just jump into the actual demo environment, if you will. As we mentioned, we're actually going to be leveraging a K19 lab. It's lab 1170 that is labeled True Vulnerability Management, Take Control and Improve Your Security Posture. This lab is designed to really give a kind of a level 1 overview of vulnerability response, but more so based on being able to divide and conquer, if you will, and being able to assign out vulnerabilities to a given location. Now, we're using location, I believe the guidebook says Chicago. We actually want to use Baltimore based on the demo data that we have in there, so we do need to make that update. But that said, really any way that you want to divide out those vulnerabilities, whether that be based on particular responsibilities or applications or locations like we've used, this guide can give you a nice overview and show you how to use the different fields within vulnerability management to delegate the work appropriately. So it walks through actually creating some user groups, creating locations, creating some roles, and then really dives more specifically into vulnerability response, remediation targets, which we'll cover, grouping the vulnerabilities. We actually create a manual group instead of a group rule. I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then being able to assign out those vulnerabilities to a group of users and ultimately working with a vulnerability group to actually dispatch a change request over to an operations team who would actually do the remediation. So without further ado, we're going to dive in, but this is available, right? So as a takeaway at the end of this recording, if this is something that you would like to look at, reach out to your ServiceNow representative and we can get you set up with a Cloud Labs environment where you can walk through this exact lab exactly as it's assigned here. It's all available, to the general public, and we want you to use it, of course. So let's just dive in here. First thing, if you end up spinning up a lab environment, you're going to notice something very similar to the favorites that you see here. Pretty much everything you need for the lab is right there in your favorites. So you don't have to navigate through the filter navigator. It's all right there. Follow along with the guide. It takes about 60 minutes at the most, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. But all the links that you need are within your favorites, which is, of course, highlighted by the star. All right, so let's talk about vulnerability response. After integration with a vulnerability scanner, which will be covered in subsequent videos, we're going to generate what's called a vulnerable item record. A vulnerable item record is nothing more than an individual occurrence of a vulnerability against an asset, right? In this case, we're using a business service electronic messaging, and then being able to look at downstream upon that. But it's a CI or an asset with a single vulnerability. In this case, we can see what that vulnerability is. Now, there's many different fields in this form that can be leveraged. And of course, we can dot walk against that actual asset and leverage, for example, its location, which would then be used for target rules, for assignment rules, for grouping rules, you name it. And you can see some of those remediation target fields. In this case, this particular vulnerability has missed its remediation target. But again, a vulnerable item is nothing more than an individual occurrence of a vulnerability against an asset or a CI. It's absolutely essential to track it at that level and to track remediation at that level, because if I have PCI or PII or some other sensitive data on this asset and we miss our target, it drives right back into that risk and compliance conversation, right? So we need to manage it at that individual vulnerability level. That said, remediating from an individual vulnerable item record is nearly impossible. And that's where we actually come into vulnerability groups. So you'll see it's labeled as VUL instead of VIT. That is a vulnerability group. We can create vulnerability groups manually. We can also create vulnerability groups with vulnerability group rules, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. And that's the ability to lump together logical work units, right? So this is where we would start to leverage things like location data, things like category of hardware or application to make sure that the work got to the right team. And a vulnerability group, you guessed it, is nothing more than a collection of vulnerable items. So a great example is if I have malware on a system and I can see the root cause of the vulnerability, do I want to patch one system or do I want to patch all of the systems? If I have an active infection in my environment, chances are I'm going to want to remediate all of the systems. So at that point in time, I would actually create a vulnerability group, or I would use vulnerability group rules to automatically manage that workload for me. But this is where we would actually do something like create a change or initiate a crisis workflow, which would actually trigger a change to go over to operations to do the remediation. And we'll talk about that here coming up. Backing up though, if we look at some of kind of the key components, one of the first things is remediation target rules, right? Because that's essentially almost a replacement for SLA. SLA can be used as well, but again, we want to manage this on an individual vulnerable item basis. So the remediation target rules basically say, how long do I have to remediate? And in this case, if we have a critical vulnerability with known exploits, we're setting a 7-day remediation target with a 3-day notification. We're also specifying who would actually be notified. In this case, we're doing Chicago field ops. The one thing that we'd probably want to add to this is, perhaps a Chicago location as well, if this is a specific remediation target rule for a given location. Any of the fields on the vulnerable item record can be used in your remediation target. And again, all that does is it sets, what our target date is, and then we'll track against that date and send out reminders and updates and notifications. This can also then be leveraged in your GRC program if you've subscribed to that as well, to say that, again, if we have PCI on a system and it's going through its remediation target, then we can see elevated risk and lack of compliance. The next thing we'll actually want to look at is vulnerability assignment rules, right? How are we actually assigning out those vulnerabilities? And just like a remediation target rule, we can use any field, if you will, on the record to make sure that the vulnerabilities get assigned to the appropriate teams. In this case, we're doing it based on hardware. So if the vulnerability summary contains Windows Server and the configuration item class is Windows Server or domain controller, then we're going to assign using assignment group and assign that out to the Windows Server patch team. This is just an example. You can review in the lab some of the demo baselines that we've added, so you can see other examples, and you can of course reverse engineer those. The last component that I want to talk about is group rules. Now we're going to have a whole separate session on group rules, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But again, these are some best practices around ways to group those individual vulnerable items to make sure that they're grouped in logical work units and then are getting assigned out to the appropriate folks based on the assignment rules that we've actually created. And so a good example of a vulnerability group rule, in this case, we're saying active is true, exploit exists is yes, and we're using some other filter criteria as well. And then we're keying in off of various keys such as assignment group or vulnerability. So again, we have quite a few out of the box in the lab that you can actually review based on demo data and reverse engineer those. However, we're going to have a whole separate recording based on vulnerability group rules that'll go into some deep best practices there. All right, the last thing I did want to leave you with is actually to initiate a crisis workflow on this vulnerability group. And again, what this is going to do is use an out-of-the-box workflow to actually trigger a change request that goes over to the operations team for them to actually do the remediation. And this is just an example workflow. You can make these your own, but this is what the lab is using. And if we look at that workflow, we can see that the first thing it's actually going to do is create a task to test those patches. And then it's going to actually create in parallel a emergency change request. Once the approval is reached for that, then we'll actually create a task to apply the patch to production. And if your vulnerability scanner allows for it with an API, we can initiate an automatic rescan. If any remaining vulnerabilities are found, it will go in a loop until none are found. And at that point in time, it will actually set the state of the vulnerability group to close. And of course, since we're initiating a rescan and pulling that information in, all of your vulnerable items will be closed as well. And so that's about it. Those are the kind of the key basics. I know it's a really quick run through. I want to try to keep this in a short and manageable time window. But check out the lab. It's available for use. Again, reach out to your ServiceNow representative or your local SC. We're happy to spin up an instance and make that available to you. And of course, let us know if you have any questions. We're here to help. All right, folks, just like we mentioned, right, this is a lab that's already out there and defined and ready to go. What should you do now? Go take a look, right? The tools are out there to help ensure your success with everything that we just talked about. Now, we've in the lab loaded certain demo data, and in your environments, it might not be there, but you can still follow through step by step. Furthermore, as I mentioned, if you would like, reach out to your ServiceNow salespersons or solution consultant. We can spin up these labs for you today inside of Cloud Labs for a period of 48 hours at a time where you can walk through this yourself. Leverage the guidebook, leverage the materials. They're there to help enable your success.
Well, thank you for this. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I particularly like the fact that this is sort of summary of what is inside the lab. For the audience, please click on the link in the PDF version of the slides and take that lab. In addition to this, I think this is super useful in the sense that it helps demystify vulnerability response. It's not that scary. It's a very solvable problem. The tools are here, and it's really a question of getting to it and going through the motions. All right, so we're at the end of this episode, and a few quick reminders before we close. The slides are available in PDF format on the forum. Make sure that you post questions if you have any on the Security Operations Forum. That's where Don and other specialists will be able to answer you. And stay tuned by subscribing to the forum to get alerted to the next tutorial. Until next time, thank you.